Hi, everyone. Good to see you, and I hope you see us and hear us. If you don't hear us, you probably have to press the mute button on your video screen. But if you don't hear us, you probably didn't hear me say that. So all the people in the comments elsewhere, please tell other people to do that if they comment about it. Help us control the crowd. My name is Dror Poleg. I am an economic historian and an author. I have a weekly newsletter about the history and future, actually. More importantly, of work, cities, buildings, corporations. I wrote a book called Rethinking Real Estate, which predicted a lot of the stuff that's happening now with offices and homes. And I'm working on a new book about where offices are headed next and how that's going to impact cities and companies and your career. So feel free to check it out. And today I have a very, very important guest, my friend, Dr. Judy Stephenson, who is a much more serious economic historian than I am. She's an associate professor at University College London. She's a research associate at Oxford University and Cambridge University. She's a director of the Long Run Institute and generally writes about the history of labor markets and the relationship with the built environment. Her insights have been featured in The Economist, the Financial Times, and beyond. And she's currently working on a book about salaries and wages, before the rise of machines and automations, I think. So Judy, after this elaborate introduction, welcome. Great to see you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to see you and talk to you.
And I think the last time we got to a chat in public was in class, probably 12 or 13 years ago.
12 or 13 years ago at LSE, absolutely. So a taster for anyone who wants to know what economic history at LSE is. It produces people like us. Yeah.
Yes, for better or worse. So let's jump back 300 years. So let's start with London. So viewed from above, what did urban work look like?
Okay, so I'm going to take you to the late 17th, early 18th century in London. So let's pretend we're talking about the period just after, within a sort of decade or 20 years after the Great Fire of London, where the city is already rebuilt and it starts growing very, very rapidly. So we're talking boom time, 17th century boom time. Urban work really in this period in London looks all about the services sector. There is production. People are making things. There's crafts. People making very, very high-end goods, particularly. Anything of high value will be made in workshops.
So what kind of goods and what kind of services are we talking about?
Oh, everything. This is a cornucopia of, wonderful new goods. This is an era of new goods. Furniture, ceramics, glass. There's glass makers in London. The Murano, makers move here in the 17th century because England has a particular approach to crystal and glass making that becomes very important in the 18th century. Sugar, the sugar bakers have, these have warehouses with these big copper pots and sort of sweeping over them. Building, construction. The construction accounts for well over 10% of the economy most of this time. Silver, gold, clothing, gloving, anything that can be consumed is being maybe not made, but assembled in London and sold in London. There's a retail environment all along Cheapside, growing into the West End. So there are skilled people making things. The unskilled people are moving stuff around. So they're kind of digging and they're moving stuff, like they're moving earth, they're moving people, they're on the river. A lot of stuff on the river. There's a lot of activity around the bridge. They're moving stuff in the markets, around the markets. They're moving things through the streets. They're also moving information. You've got lots of watchmen and messengers who are basically running around with little messages and bills and things all over the city. Apparently the traffic is much worse than today. It takes 2 hours to cross London Bridge at some point in this period. And that's by foot. So
where are they running? Where is most work produced? Are people in offices, in factories? Where is the workplace? What does the workplace look like?
That's a good question. So the workplace is the city in a sense. The conception that we have of a workplace, like of an office or a manufactory to do with a particular employer, That's not quite the same. To understand the conception of what a workplace is, there are workshops and sellers of goods where some people come to work, but most of the people who would have work with that place or with that trader don't necessarily work in the same place. It's only the apprentices and the very, very, most people don't have a full-time job. They just have occasional work. Particularly the unskilled tend to be out and about. They're outside in markets moving things around. They're on the river, or they are moving between, warehouses and sites. People who are beginning to have what we conceive of as an office are in administrative roles, and they have positions. But even like Sam Pepys, Samuel Pepys, who was the most famous Londoner of this period.
Because he wrote a diary that everyone still refers to, yeah? That's
absolutely, like it's very naughty. But his life is getting out and about. He's got a major position on the Navy board. He's a secretary of the Admiralty. And his life is going out and about and meeting people in coffee houses and meeting people in other administrative offices. But he doesn't have a desk he goes to every day. And he works bizarre hours, crazy hours.
So that's like a typical, if we're zooming into one type of person. So what does a typical day look like for like a merchant or a position holder?
Yeah. So it consists of meetings a lot of meetings that one has to have.
But the meetings happen where?
Well, they happen in people's houses. So merchants particularly do have a workplace, and it's a combination of the family home, which is and that was where you would have meetings, if you like. These are about intimacy. This is a tradition that carries on particularly in banking, right up to the 20th century. In the big banking houses. But you also then have a place of accounting house. And you also then have a place where stuff is stored, inventory is stored. So there are, 3 or 4.
So the office is at home. It's like a townhouse of some sort where you have your meetings. Then there's a separate place where clerks sit, I guess, but not hundreds of them. I would gather.
The talks come much later. So if you look at, so let's take a 17th century bank, one of the first, Whores, which still have offices on Fleet Street, pretty much in the same place there. The structure of the building at the time were offices where the senior bankers could, the people actually taking deposits and working out the risk and saying, will we lend, would be. But the work of the clerks and the record keepers was done elsewhere. And it's literally just a book with a place to write. It's not that those people don't have a workspace, as it were. And the tradition, certainly within the church and within sort of bigger organizations, is that there are, there's a desk or a place where the book is, but that's not necessarily your work place, except for the very, 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 sacred monks. So in the late 17th, early 18th century, the notion of a workplace, our notion of a workplace is confounded by two things in that area. First of all, most people don't work for the same employer all the time. Like the job, nobody really has a job. People have bits of work. They have some work that they're doing right now, and they might be working for somebody else in a few months' time. And the place, they're more likely to be moving around between places that things have to be exchanged than actually in one place. So the whole city is a buzz the whole time. But the notion of having, a desk and something that you come into every day is much more modern than that.
So it's more of an idealized kind of capitalist world that kind of Adam Smith wrote about before we started thinking about firms and offices, of like, a price coordination mechanism kind of sends people around, whether on a daily basis or monthly basis, to just do whatever the economy thinks.
The market is all around you. Yes, the market is all around you. And I think it's important to say that people are not being paid, in steady jobs. So when they do get paid, they get paid for the thing that they sell, the task that they're asked to carry out, or to, to hold a position and take responsibility for a certain thing for a certain amount of time.
So presenteeism is not a big deal in the 17th and 18th century. So whatever you produce, you get paid for it. And so we spoke a little bit about like the upper class people, and maybe we can come back to them. But if we want to zoom in on like a white collar or like a laborer during that period, what does their life look like? Like, what are they doing? Where are they doing it? How are they getting paid for it?
So laborers in London at the time are either working on construction sites or they're hauling stuff around. And the people who are hauling stuff, they're working on construction sites, they will be working a 12 or 13-hour day with a break in the middle and possibly a break. So very early, about 6 a.m. right through to, evening, depending on the light. Sometimes it's shorter in winter. There'll be a break for food in the middle of the day. It's their food. Nobody's giving it to them. And it's basically hard graft. The life of a laborer is men die early for a reason, in that, you're working brutal, physical, hard labor all day. On the river, what you're doing is you're hauling stuff from place to place. And because you're paid for the task, not for your time when you're hauling, you basically, there's a lot of hanging around on the river looking for things, moving stuff on lighters, which are the small boats that go between the larger boats and the shore, and that go between the larger boats and through under London Bridge and up to the different steps. You might be working for 6 or 7 employers in a day.
Wow. So like an Uber, like the Uber drivers of the river, basically.
The Uber drivers are the same thing, and the city, that turns into quite a tough market, and the city regulates it. It says, right, there's this much, these are the rates that can be paid for watermen and lightermen and hauliers, and this is how they're going to pick up tickets for those things, and everybody has to be registered and do all that kind of stuff. So that gets regulated early. The time, in terms of that, also work is really seasonal. Mm-hmm. So the time of year that we are now, early March, work is just picking up again, because in early modern London in services, people don't do much in January and February. It's called Candlemas. There's this, all work records show people working really, really hard up to December 25th. And then January, February, there's a few people flicking stuff around. And then in March, work picks up again before the big accounting day, which is Lady Day on the 25th.
So just to summarize where we are until now. So we're looking at a city where, as you said, like the workplace is the city, or the city is the office, as some say these days. People are mostly unaffiliated with large organizations. I mean, large organizations largely don't exist so much, apart from a handful. And both kind of the upper class and the working class people, they tend to work or do business with multiple different employers or partners. Work is generally more kind of piecemeal or contract-based, rather than just getting paid for your time. So every spatial arrangement in terms of where people work and how cities are designed seems to dictate, or at least reflect, some kind of economic arrangement. So did the location of these workplaces affect how people were compensated, how many hours they worked, other aspects of their lives?
Well, yes, I think it's the other aspects of their lives is, I'm talking about, apart from hard laboring, I'm talking about both women and men. Because women particularly are very well represented in the goods market. And so they tend to, own that small, kind of workshop or warehouse, and people come in, they have apprentices, they have servants. The children are living out, with nurses or other family, or are in and apprenticed. But there's servants and other people maybe, and these are the people who are in a workplace, by the way, is domestic servants. Both those who come in with the aristocracy for the season, and those who are also attached to, households and houses. How
are they employed, by the way? So they're like maybe an example of an early employee, like the Downton Abbey kind of downstairs.
Most of that is done on what you call so even that contract is very short by today's job comparisons, because you sign up for a year.
Okay.
So at the end of every year, you kind of go, are we doing this again? And the contract is, we'll pay you this much at the end of the year, and then this is the kind of board and lodging you have. Yes, you're allowed butter. You're not having cheese. Yes, we'll get you livery or clothes. You can have an allowance for this or whatever. And it totally depends on the
But
household.
you get paid at the end of the contract. Until then, you're just basically allowed to live and eat. And
yeah, if there is a cash payment, you get paid at the end of the contract. Absolutely.
Okay.
Nothing in between, because you're sort of put up in between. So some live very well. If you're part of a nice household, this is great. If you're not, also great.
I'm trying to negotiate something similar with my wife now, just to let me know.
Well, indeed. But the other people who are making goods, of course, are not, because they're working for different people. Their incomes are dependent on demand. So obviously they've got very little income in January and February. Then they'll work very hard for maybe other bits of the year. It really depends on what we think of as effective demand. But they might have a lot of work and work very long hours, through the nights, or subcontract to other people at peak times, and then that would break again. So essentially what this means, the relationship between the kind of workplace and the economic arrangement, is the idea of work is very precarious. So what we understand as, you've got a job, you're paid a salary, you're paid for your time. These are not assumptions you can make for early modern workers, who assume that there will be work and an income will come, but who mostly also have to do their own accounting and write their own bill.
So before my next question, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions about the history of work that you want to throw at Judy or me, drop them in the comments, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter, wherever you are. I'm trying to keep track of everything. Let me have a look here just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And okay, so moving along. So when and why did this arrangement stop? Like, when and why did work move out of the house? Did it happen at once? Did it happen in waves? What happened? How did we end up here?
How did we end up here? Exactly, good point. So two things happened, particularly at the end of the 18th century. The first is that the manufacture of goods becomes industrialized and moves away from London largely. It still lingers in London and the other big cities in workshops, right to the end of the 19th century. But large-scale employment moves out of cities and into factories. And the experiments in how
technological trigger, so like steam and later other types of power basically require more people to be around the machines or to move stuff towards the machines.
It's generally held to be about the energy, about the power. You know what I mean? Like the source of the big, and this is why you get sort of tall factories as well. There's there's one power source before electrification. When you're doing steam, there's one power source, one lever. And the machines are basically into that, which also gives you a limit on the total number of machines that you can have. But these manufactories tend to be built outside of cities, close to coal and water power, and that creates a new type of work, where obviously then the administrative job of organizing it, accounting for it, paying for it, managing suppliers and all that kind of stuff turns into the white collar aspects of industrialized businesses.
And that remains in the city, or it moves out first and then comes back when it has telegraphs or other ways to communicate?
It doesn't really come back into London until the end of the 19th century, except apart from some, like London kept sugar and a couple of other industries, but most industry takes off in the northwest of England, in what is now Manchester and Lancashire. So
where the good music is.
Where the good music is, yes. They're completely correlated, absolutely. So that turns the workplace, and at the same time, because the state starts organizing military action, particularly in a much bigger way through the Revolutionary Wars, the organization of state and its administration gets bigger, and that leads you to more big offices. So Somerset House, which is on the river here, just opposite LSE, is the first. Damn, we need some office space. 1775. We need big office space, and that becomes the model for offices for many big organizations, banks and merchant insurers and all the kind of financial services and other services around there as well. And essentially what those early offices are they're still counters. They're not places where you have desks and cups of tea and places to hang out and any kind of lifestyle. They are counters where stuff, accounts can be written. And it's only in the mid-19th century that you start to have the continuation of clerks or administrators who are paid for their time, who you can see and oversee. So it's really the oversight of work and firms beginning to manage productivity in the sense of looking at people and managing them from the early 19th century onwards that creates what we understand as the modern workplace. And this
By
is...
the way, speaking of tea, you know, I wrote about it last week. In the 1910s, there was a very fierce discussion on the pages of the New York Times about whether American offices should adopt the 4 p.m. tea, just like in England. And a lot of people had very strong opinions about the Brits not really working too hard, and Americans would never have time to drink tea at 4 p.m. because they're actually hard at work and it's distracting. And then they did some research and found that people can actually drink tea and work at the same time, which was a revelation apparently in American business.
Can you imagine the crisis of etiquette, though? You know, like all this.
Yeah. So they could take dictation and sip in parallel.
Yeah. So the urban structure of work around services really only grows from the mid-19th century onwards.
And then what happens? So you mentioned that a lot of manufacturing moves out of the city, let's say 250 years ago or so, or a little earlier, maybe in England. What happens to all of those offices that used to be in houses and to all the places that hosted people working? How are houses being transformed as a response to that?
So houses are being transformed in the sense that suburbanization is not just a 20th century phenomenon. From the late 18th century, the well-to-do merchants started building pretty villas, you know, a couple of miles from the city centre. So the first bit of that is what we now call Belgravia and Chelsea. And the subsequent bits of that are what is now Zone 3 of London. You know, the Wimbledons, the Streathams, the Hampsteads are the nice places where well-to-do, well-heeled professional classes built big villas for easy access to the city. So that's the sort of first wave of suburbanization, which has actually been going through since the early 17th century, when the city of London got too crowded and noisy before the fire, and everyone was like, ugh, you know, too much. So you have this constant cycle of you know, living and working and living and working within the big cities. It's you know, New York has the same with its suburbs. And there's these constant power balances between, but essentially for a period then in the 20th century, professional work moved out of big cities. I mean, we all moved out of big cities. Big cities went out of fashion and then went back into fashion in the late 1980s, you know, with the, you know, kind of globalized financial services and professional services. But until that, generally the trend across the 19th century was, you know, to build stuff within the city for work. And the model that you have in New York turned into the skyscraper because of the use of steel, and the model that we have in here in London in the UK because of planning and many things to do with the fire and lack of steel, and so also a first mover disadvantage. The high rise thing never got going. So there is a very particular kind of class structure to 19th century buildings. I mean, in that there are certain classes of clerk and just administrative workers who, you know, have no access to the real places of power in the building. So places are much more segmented than they would be today. Like there's literally, you know, entrances for junior staff, you know, entrances for plebs and entrances for the officers and other places as well.
So you mentioned a few times, you know, things came up like wars, fires, and obviously we are now living on the heels of, you know, an own kind of external disaster with COVID, and we tend to look at it as, you know, as a trigger for massive changes in the way people live and work. So what are, like, looking back 300 years, what are the kind of main disasters or shocks that shaped the kind of relationship between the city and the office and the home, and what was their impact?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Great Fire is one, and when London was completely razed in the 60s, people thought it would never get going again. That's one thing that happens all the time, is they go, oh, it's never going to work again. The other main crises are usually financial crises.
Okay.
So the financial crisis, well, war and financial crisis, but for instance, the big financial crises of the mid 1860s, the Gurney Brothers crisis here in the UK, banking crisis, created a number of bankruptcies, which created what we would call redundancies, which created a bit of a real estate crisis, which created demolitions, repurposes, reusages.
So it sounds like 2023, basically.
Sounds like 2023. The other big change for London, of course, was after the Second World War, where large parts of the city were, razed through the bricks.
Yeah.
And actually rebuilding there took a lot longer than it had in 1660. There were bits of London that did not get filled in again until the late 70s, early 1980s. And structurally, that created first of all, it brought it slowed down residential growth until the 1980s. So London didn't have as much of a workforce as it does now. But the second thing it does is it split. It confirmed the split between financial services, which had always been in the city, but there had been other things too, and other types of services in the West End, and that became even more solidified after the Second World War. Whereas before that, the two had mixed up more.
So, which again, parallel process, I'd say, in North America as well, in terms of like specific industries or specific office work really becoming segregated into specific parts of the city and have their own buildings with their own shape and style. I want to leave some time for a question or two from the audience, but I think between the lines came out a lot of like social issues, whether it is safety, inequality, general kind of squalor and poverty. What are some policies that help cities address the shortcomings of the early modern work from home world? And, both in terms of their positive intended effects or also maybe some unintended effects that we can learn from, hopefully, today as we're heading into a world that sounds disturbingly similar.
So the thing where there's both regulation and investment from like a higher force, it's got to be transportation. That's the thing that that makes London's workplaces, as they establish in a kind of fixed way in the 19th century, accessible to what you might call the working class. And the partnership, so the railways are all private enterprises, but the private-public partnership in terms of planning and how those get constructed, which is sometimes disastrous and sometimes brilliant, is absolutely critical to the path dependency of how the city comes together. So in terms of like policy, having a policy about where those stations go and where they come into and where where the lines are has really fundamentally affected the long run working practice and housing as well. So in terms of housing, again, regulation from a safety, health and safety, kind of a fire and, living standards point of view.
Standardizing basically where people should be allowed to live at all.
And speculate, especially services, particularly like it's the sewers and the waters and and what used to be the churches, those were seen as vital services till the late 19th century. It's those things, the zoning of them, the planning of them, which was coordinated by both private investors and public servants that created the ability for there to be essentially the late 19th and 20th century model is little houses, and workers moving around within a particular city, whereas what we had come from in the 17th century had been sort of large places, kind of, and not as non-self-contained households and cells and houses, and a sort of interconnectedness. And I mean, I can see in the chat people are going, there seems to be something in this that we're looking at again, and the real question of do we go into the center or are we just buzzing all around? All around is the hot question now, I guess.
All right. So I see we're at time, but I think we can continue for a few more minutes. We have a few questions to address here with the audience.
Yeah, quite a few questions.
So good question here from George. It's a little long to read, but basically, you described the transition to industrial work pretty quickly. Does that feel rapid to people living through it? Did it happen gradually? What would people have noticed kind of changing around them living there at the time? And what were the things that were more sticky and kind of didn't change quickly enough, or still didn't change at all?
So I think the biggest changes, and also the changes where we have biographies and kind of people's spoken word on this for the first time, come from the early 19th century, after the Revolutionary Wars, when the railways are beginning to be laid out. And people will say, well, I grew up around here, around Moorfields, or what is now, and there were green fields and you could see the city. And now here I am 40 years later, and it's houses from here to whatever, and I go into work on a railway line, and I'm working in a particular way for a regular employer, which I wasn't. So that sort of would have happened over a 30 or 40 year period between 1815 and 1845, and it's quite profound. I think that would have been really noticeable for the first time.
All right, and another question from Michael. So you mentioned those kind of early suburbs to the west of the city. I mean, today, obviously, very central, very expensive, but back then, the suburbs. Were they driven by railroad lines or something else?
So only the third wave development of late 19th century development is dependent on the railway lines after 1850 or so. Before that, the burbs are really about who's got land and who can sell it to the best developer. There's a wonderful new biography of Nicholas Barbon by Tim Walker in the London Topographical Society, which basically says how the planning model of buy the land, here's the leasehold for development, here's the leasehold for the long rental scheme, and how they financed all these things. But one of the first suburbs is just north here of the Bedford estate. Is called Somerstown, which was bits of another manorial estate which were sold off to keep that particular duchy going, and where you've got large scale basically construction managers who want to profit by who have a modular way of building houses, and who can get so many houses up in a season and get a cash flow in. So they are driven by the construction industry's supply chains more than any, and some transportation issues. More than
and I think in England, also here in the US, but I think in England, I mean, the first real suburbanites were like the royals or upper classes that could just basically live in a palace and own land and didn't have to work in the city or have anything to do with it. And then those that had a coach or could the upper class merchants maybe could move out of the city because they wanted to live like aristocrats.
Well, this is, and the city, particularly the 18th century city, is planned around, there's the Garden Square is the predominant way that the rich like to live, because they think it's airy and lovely. There's a pile of poo, literally poo in the corner. Do you know what I mean? Because, the way of dealing with rubbish is not what we would consider, healthy. But these idea that these garden squares, give you fresh air, you're away from the animals. However, at the hint of plague or cholera or anything else, they take off out of the city as soon as they can. And of course, the poor are left behind, unable to afford the transport.
And the Garden Square for Americans is like those cute little parks that you see in neighborhoods in London, like, in Notting Hill or Marylebone or Mayfair, where you have a bit like in Gramercy in New York, which is kind of a rare style, but very British. But in London, there's much more of that.
Absolutely. It's Notting Hill. It's Cadogan Square. It's got that nice pot in the middle where you think everyone's sitting out having tea in the summer. Yeah.
All right. So last question for me. So looking ahead, where do you see cities, offices, homes in 50 years? What can we learn from history as we kind of go through our own great reshuffle triggered by plague, soon looks like financial crisis of some sort, and who knows what other fun awaits us?
I think that's as dependent on the firm as it is dependent on public investment in city spaces. So firms at the moment are making decisions about they want everybody in the office, but they want everybody also to be able to work from home. You know what I mean? If there's a crisis, or if the offices can't be used for whatever reason. But that fundamentally changes the nature of employment, because we're all paid for our time. And if you're not in the office and somebody can see what you're doing, you're not going to be paid for your time. You're going to be paid for your output, your project fee, as it were. So, and then there's a question about, do you manage people who are working on projects, or do you, are they employees, or are they subcontractors? So the management decisions that, shareholder-driven organizations make about that question, about how they make labor productive, will affect how we use the office. And
if you had to bet on what they will decide and what the outcome will be physically when we look at the city?
I think it would be unusual if things became more centralized than they were, because work has never been so centralized as it was at the end of the 20th century. So I can't see corporations getting, the trend is actually for corporations not to get bigger in terms of headcount. You know what I mean? They may be getting cash richer, but very richer, but they're not getting bigger in terms of headcount. So that leaves me to believe that we'll get more desegregated and more, like, there'll be more vertical disintegration. And what that means is that you're not going to have any more rock centers. You're not going to have any more 1251s. You're not going to have, buildings that are assigned to organizations, particularly that are known as places of work for that organization. You're going to have buildings that are shared and rented by lots of different players. And it also means that what we think about as suburbia will, actually probably become a nicer place to be, because people will be, workers will be there more. And the services around it, in terms of like all the stuff that was in the nice office kitchen.
So more mixed uses, basically, in the
more mixed use, exactly. That's culturally interesting as well. So that would be my prediction, is like we couldn't get any more centralized than we were, so it's probably going the other way. Yeah.
I tend to agree. I think we tend to use the 1950s as kind of a benchmark of normal life, while historically it's such a unique and extreme period in so many ways.
Completely.
Again, not that it's good or bad, but just like thinking that we'll ever go back there, I think is something that we're slowly learning to let go of. So Judy, before I thank you officially and say goodbye, there's another question that I think we don't have to answer today, but it kind of it connects me to an event I have next week. So Ronan asked about the 15-minute city. It seems to be a very polarizing issue at the moment. People hate it, people love it. Next week, I'm hosting another live chat with Alain Berthaud, who is like an urban planner and like a very distinguished, kind of interesting thinker about the evolution of cities and transportation networks. And I think he has a lot to say about that, less from the conspiracy theory side of things and more just about in thinking, the role of planners in trying to shape economic activities and physical environment. So Ronan and everyone else, make sure to join me there as well. And Judy, this was so much fun. We definitely should do it more frequently than every 12 years. Thank you so much for joining and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. And I hope to see you soon in sunny London.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, George.
And sorry, and I'll have to mention, where should people find you? I know that on Twitter you're at Judy Zara. Anywhere else in particular where people should?
That's where I hang out. Yeah, I'm trying to write the book Wages Before Machines at the moment. So it's desperate plug at the end. So yeah, so I'm not hanging out that much, but that's where I hang out. Yeah.
So yeah, Judy is very prompt at answering to her DMs, regardless of what she just said. So look her up on Twitter at Judy Zara. Follow me as well if you aren't already at Dror Poleg. Thank you all for listening and watching, and thank you again, Judy. And we'll see you all again soon. Bye bye.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Thank you very much.